Today we're having an interview with Terri Swank, a veteran from Ohio. So Terri, thanks so much for doing this and to recording your experiences for the VBC History Project. Let me start by asking, how did you decide to go into the military? How old were you and what years?
So when I was in high school, I was also going to a vocational school to be a medical assistant. And in our senior year, some of us were talking about going into the military. So we asked for a recruiter to come out and talk to us. It was like 20 something, I think, in our class. And by the time the recruiter left, everybody's like, oh yeah, we're all going to do this and so on. And when it came down to it, there were only two of us that actually enlisted. So I joined the military because it sounded like a good idea at the time. The recruiter, gave a good pitch, and plus I wanted to go to college. I didn't have means to pay for that. And there was no way that my mom was able to pay for it. And I always, since I was a little kid, wanted to be a nurse. So, and then plus at the time, there was a whopping $1,500 bonus that I signed up for. So it was a way to pay for school. I was also, excuse me, a very shy, quiet kid growing up, all the way through high school. And after I signed, I'm like, what am I thinking? And that was a week after I graduated high school when I enlisted. So I was 18 years old. And that
what year was that?
Pardon?
What year was that?
That was June of 1979. And then I went to basic training at Fort McClellan, Alabama, which is kind of near Mobile.
Mm-hmm.
So late 70s, and that was in August. So August in Alabama, it was a little warm. Plus it's post-Vietnam, and some of our drill sergeants were Vietnam veterans. And then plus back then, they say jump and you say how high. And that, because that's just how it was,
Mm-hmm.
So they were strict. Of course, as you probably know, we didn't have what's called a PT uniform like they have now. Well, we had a PT uniform, but it was your uniform. You take off your blouse and your hat, you fold up your blouse, put it on the ground, you take off your hat, put on top of it, and then the formation moves away from all those uniforms on so it's your boots, your pants, and at the time, white t-shirt. And that's your PT uniform.
Wow.
Yeah. So we ran PT in our boots.
We done in our brogans, so I know the feeling.
Yeah. And your feet got broken. I went through basic training. It was co-ed. 2 platoons of women, 2 platoons of men. And we did everything together. Yeah. What we did, because of a hurricane, we got out of I think it was the 12-mile road march, because we weren't allowed to go anywhere. We were confined to the barracks, and we had to move all the bunks in towards the center of the barracks, and kind of barricade up the windows, because it's Alabama and it's hurricane season.
So what was it like training with male counterparts? Were you accepted? Was it difficult?
No, I think I didn't look at it as at the time as being any different, because it's just what we did.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, at the time, I didn't realize, because I was pretty naive too, that, you put men and women together, well, 18, 19-year-old kids, and,
Mhm.
people trying to sneak off and do this and that. And, which, yeah, I was clueless to until later that, people were telling me about it. I'm like, oh, okay. Oh, wow. But as far as all the training, I mean, you just did your thing, and as a group, and yeah. And I don't know, maybe the guys thought that it was too easy because they had women. But we all had the standard. Other than, the only thing that was different was our PT requirements, because what they require males to do versus the females to do was a little different. But yeah.
Wow. So then you go off to your training. So where did that take place?
So my AIT was at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, which is in San Antonio, to become a medic, or as they called them back then, medical specialist. So that was, oh boy, November, I guess September, October. Yeah, October, November time period. And back then, Fort Sam, as we call it, was an open post. So it was a lot different, than a lot more relaxed. It was called the Country Club of the Army back then,
Oh, wow.
because we didn't really have we had a bed check at midnight during the week, and then Friday, no bed check until Sunday at midnight. And you could go do whatever you wanted to. Of course, the only thing you had to do was sign out and sign back in. So it was pretty wild. With the requirement, I mean, you're still doing your PT, but there was a lot of partying, going to the club, going off post out into San Antonio. Yeah, it was a pretty wild time.
I could imagine.
Yeah.
So what was it? I'm assuming that given the time period, that the trainers that you had to become a medic were trainers that had been in Vietnam, or many of them.
Some of them, yes.
What
Yes.
was that like? And the kind of their training based on having gone through the experiences that they did in a combat zone.
So we had drill sergeants for the company, but then we had instructors for the classes.
Mhm.
If that makes any sense.
Right.
So they were all pretty hard on us, and and you had time requirements to do the different performances. And there were some people that really struggled with, the bandages or whatever. But it wasn't, I don't know. I just don't recall it being, you feel pressured because you don't want to fail. Um, and then, there's always that chance of getting recycled, to the next class. But I don't recall, like, come on, you got to save this life, type thing, um, or any of that kind of Vietnam experience coming out,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So after you finished your training, you become a medic. Where did this end you?
So then I come back home, because I'm in the National Guard,
Okay.
and I was in the medical unit. It was a clearing company. So there are 3 medical platoons, and then the headquarters section. And the headquarters section was like your mechanics, your cooks, your administrative people, all those other people that support the unit.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in one of the medical platoons, and I'm just a little private, nothing. And I'm really enjoying, my new life in the military, even though it was only part-time. So it was 1 week in the month and 2 weeks in the summer back then. And at the same time, so the National Guard was still, it had a reputation of partying. Um, but we focused on what we needed to do during the training day, but then in the evening, the beers would break out and so on. But my first sergeant was a Marine from Vietnam who had been injured. Um, and so he's a big guy, and he had this booming voice. So he just commanded respect. I don't know, maybe it's because he put the fear of God in people, just by his appearance and the way he carried himself. But at the same time, it was a situation that, he would go around and check on things to make sure things were being done, but he would also pitch in at times and do things, and whatever we're doing. So he was a great leadership mentor. And I learned a lot from him, and he was hard. I mean, you're not going to BS this guy. And he demanded pretty much excellence, which was fine. And the same with the well, I can't even remember now which commander. Oh yeah, the commander was yeah. So he was, a great guy too. He wasn't a Vietnam veteran, but we also had others in the medical unit that were Vietnam veterans. One was an OR tech, and he had been in the OR in Vietnam. One was a what's called a 91 Charlie, which is an LPN, and he had been in Vietnam. And supposedly there was a wanted posters out for him in Vietnam. So, and some others, Vietnam veterans. So we had some great teachers, and we worked hard and we played hard.
That's the military.
Yeah. Yeah. Even though the National Guard at that time still had the reputation of partying, when it was time to do the job, we did the job. That was the priority.
Right.
But then after hours, it's our time.
So you stayed in the National Guard how long?
36 years.
Wow. And I know you got called into deployments during that time frame. So what were some of the deployments in particular later when the Iraq War and the Gulf War took place? So where did they end up sending you, and what were you required to do there?
Well, I'm going to back up a little bit.
Sure.
So I went up through the ranks to E7 platoon sergeant. And one of the things, which I think there was only one other female platoon sergeant at the time. And one of the things I learned as a platoon sergeant, so you have people from all walks of life in the military, wherever you are. And I learned that, so even though I'm the E7 platoon sergeant, the youngest private can have the best idea. And so I learned that you're not only, you always make the call with your platoon leader, but to listen to suggestions or ideas from all the soldiers, because that private may have the best idea, a different perspective on how they see something. And, maybe not, but sometimes they did. And as a leader, you have to learn to listen to people and not just, well, it's my way or the highway kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, and to take all those into consideration, and then, you still have to make that decision. So that was a big lesson, with, being a platoon sergeant. And then plus at the same time, I was AGR, which is Active Guard and Reserve. So in 1982, our unit was authorized more full-time positions. So I applied and was selected for one. And so any National Guard unit, you have some full-timers, and the reserve units too, you have some full-timers that have to run the unit day-to-day operations. And so I was doing that and whatever my unit job was on the drill weekends. And because I was active duty, I also had to go to the active duty NCO schools instead of the reserve component, like a 2-week reserve school.
Mhm.
So my PLDC was a month down at Fort Knox. PLDC is Primary Leadership Development Course. So that's for like your E4s, E5s. And then BNOC, which is basic NCO course, was 16 weeks at Fort Sam Houston, because that's where all the medical courses are.
Mhm.
And that was, so when I was at BNOC, 90, 91, the Gulf War broke out. And then 2 months, 94 was my ANOC advanced NCO school. So I still had to go through all those courses, just like the active duty, so there were people
Sure.
from all over the Army going to these courses from the medical perspective. And when I was there for ANOC, so towards the end, we had to do a field exercise. It was 72 hours long. And I was the RTO, the radio operator. And I still laugh at it. So being female, being National Guard, when I went to pick up the radio for our exercise, one of the other students was the one signing them out and then making sure that we knew how to operate them. And so he's 82nd Airborne, got the beret and everything. And so he's given us a class on how to operate the radio. So it's still the same ones from Vietnam.
So it's still a prick 5.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or the prick 66, I'm sorry. The bigger one that you carry on your back. And so he keeps looking at me, giving us these instructions. Because obviously I'm a female National Guard and I don't know anything. And so, like, okay, so when, he's done doing his class and I'm signing for my radio, he's like, do you have everything? Are you good? Do you have any questions? And I'm like, yeah, I think, I think I got it. And, I'm like, I'll play your game. So we go out and do our field exercise. And, anytime we moved, we had to call in our coordinates. But we also had to encrypt them. So you had, your little sheet on how to encrypt them. And, so I'm constantly, calling in, we had a drive-by, I called it a drive-by shooting, your spot reports and, all the other things that were happening. And, I'm all over it. And I slept with the radio because they would do checks throughout the night. So the exercise is over and I take my radio back to turn it in. And he's like, I am very impressed with what you did out there. I would go with you anywhere.
Oh, wow.
I'm like, oh, okay. So, that was kind of a taste of what you face as a woman sometimes in the military is
Sure.
and sometimes I would just, let it roll off, but sometimes, okay, I'll play the game and, be the, oh, I don't know, tell me what I need to do, and then just go out and do it like it's nothing, and, you know, um, not let it rattle you. So then um, I'm an E7, and I was going to school part-time, to college. And in one of my classes, there was a guy, and he started talking about a PA, a physician assistant. And I'm like, well, what's that? And so he tells me, what it is. And I'm like, oh, that sounds really interesting. I'll have to check into that. So then I found out that the military has a PA program. And I went to our medical recruiting and got all the information for the prerequisites and so on. So I started taking classes to cover those prerequisites. And then once I had enough of the prerequisites, then I applied. So the first time I applied, and they have a board, and then like 2 weeks after the board, they let you know what the results are. And 9/11 happened. And so the board was canceled. But they didn't tell us that the board had been canceled. So, we're waiting. And then finally we got word that it was canceled. So in the long run, it took me 3 times because they canceled the board another time because they didn't have the people. And then so finally I was selected to go to the military PA program, which is called IPAP, the Inter Service Physician Assistant Program, which consists of Army, Navy, and Air Force personnel, because the Navy provides for the Marines.
Right. No
Um,
chaplains, no medics.
what?
And Marines, no chaplains, no medics.
Right. And so that was September of 2002 through 2004 that I went to that. And that was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. It is a very challenging program, and they liken it to strapping on, taking a hose from a fire hose and strapping it on, turning it on full blast, and don't spill a drop.
Yep.
Because they're giving you so much information in one sitting, day after day after day. And, you just have to keep all that in there and retain it to, get through the course. It was very challenging. At the same time, in the first semester, I got a Dear John letter, or Dear Jane, from the guy that I was dating at the time. So that added stress to what I was already going through.
I could imagine.
Yeah. But I don't know how, sometimes when I look back at it, I kept it together and managed to graduate. And then came back and I got a job at the James Cancer Hospital, which is part of OSU Medical Center. So now I am a traditional National Guard soldier, working full-time at the hospital, and then doing my National Guard drills on the weekends. So at the same time, while I was at PA school down at Fort Sam Houston again, the Iraq War started. So knowing that, we're going to deploy after graduation, my active duty counterparts, their first duty station was going to be a unit, Fort Stewart or Fort Drum or whatever, who was next on the list to deploy. And while I was in PA school, you know, we had units that were already deploying. So when I came back, I knew I was going to deploy at some point. And so when a unit came up, a medical unit came up to go, or, you know, preparing to go, then I volunteered to be transferred to that unit so that I had control over who I was going to deploy with. And that was to Iraq in 2006 and 2007. And that was with a medical unit also. It was Area Support Medical Company. So that consisted of a treatment platoon, an ambulance platoon, and a headquarters platoon. So I was in the treatment platoon, and the slots were 3 PAs, 3 doctors, and a nurse, as far as and then the medics. So when we get to Iraq, we're in the Baghdad area. And some of it's pretty because there are some really beautiful palaces there that Saddam had built, you know, for himself, I guess. And we're in a big camp. Well, we had 3 sites. And I was at the Liberty base, the Liberty, Camp Liberty, which is on the Victory base, which was huge. And so Victory Base Complex, it had all these FOBs within it, smaller FOBs. So I was at a big clinic on Camp Liberty, and it was a what's called a Role 2 or Level 2. So the military levels of medical care are the opposite of the civilian side. So on the civilian side, a Level 1 hospital is a big trauma center.
Right.
On the military, a Level 1 is a BAS, a battalion aid station.
Right.
So it goes 1, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger on the military side. So I'm in a Level 2, so it's a clinic with more medics. We have pharmacy, X-ray, lab, and patient holding capability for 48 hours. So the majority of our care during this time, it's routine sick call or primary care or like urgent care. And one of the doctors was an ER doctor, so I was like a sponge with him, you know, to learn as much as possible because I'm, you know, still a fairly new PA. And I don't know, we were there a few weeks when our first casualty came in. He was an American who was a contractor driving a big truck and just, you know, driving from point A to point B, hit an IED, and it pretty much severed his foot off, but it was still hanging on by a little bit. So, you know, that was an eye-opener. I'm like, okay, this is real, you know. And then also, you know, at the same time, we have the doctor, so he, you know, is the senior person calling the shots, but the medics look to us. And so you have to keep in mind, however you react is going to flow downhill, you know, so you got to keep the blinders on and stay focused and not panic or anything like that, you know, remain calm. So, you know, of course, the goal is to get them stabilized, provide any care that you can do, and then evac them to the next level. So they would always get evacuated to the CASH, which is the Combat Support Hospital, which was also in Baghdad. There were some others in country, but ours went to Baghdad, and then, they would do the same, or if they needed to do surgery, and then send them back to the States. So half,
So I know that in the early days of physician's assistant, when they came up with the new concept of increasing what nurses did and take it to a new level of having, excuse me, of having a physician's assistant that in essence does everything a doctor does, except surgeries and some things like that. In the early days, there was a little bit of friction, I think, between some physicians and PAs. You were at one of those early stages, not only for women in the military doing more things within a combat zone in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also on the medical side as a PA. So how did you find that?
So some of the doctors were quite receptive to the PA. I would say the majority of them, because we're taking some of the burden off of them. We're not threatening, whereas I did encounter, some of the doctors that I think in their mindset that we were threatening to their practice, and we're going to take patients or take business or whatever their thinking was. So there was a doctor that I was with in Iraq that wasn't fond of PAs. And I was put on night shift during his time there. So, and there was nothing I could do because I'm a lieutenant. He is a colonel. So, I took my licks and just, okay, I'm relegated to doing the night shift. And then over time, so there were a couple other doctors that kind of stuck up for me and, got that shifted a little bit. So that helped. But yeah, so in the beginning, and even though, so the PA program started in 1965, and the first class graduated with 3 Navy corpsmen becoming PAs in 1967 at Duke University. So, and this is 2004, 2006, so we had been around for a while, and PAs were created because of the shortage of primary care physicians.
Right.
And even though, not all PAs go into primary care. I mean, I didn't go into primary care initially, or actually primary care in the military, but on the civilian side, I was not primary care. But and still today, there's a shortage of physicians. There just aren't, the numbers aren't applying to med school. So that's why you have your physician assistants or your nurse practitioners to help with that burden.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
But you just suck it up and go on.
So your tour in Iraq, how long did that last, that first tour?
I was there for a year. So PAs at that time deployed for a year. And I think it was during that deployment that they changed it to you could do 6 months, whereas physicians only deployed for 90 days. So for the whole year, we had the rotation of physicians coming through. But I decided that, well, I'm just going to do the whole year. And I have no regrets. It was an opportunity to learn a lot, um, professionally and personally. Um, because I think I would have felt guilty if I didn't do the whole year.
Mhm.
I don't know, maybe I'm crazy.
You are, but in a good,
Oh, okay.
but in a very good way.
Uh,
Uh,
so about halfway through the deployment, then I was moved to one of our other fobs to replace one of our PAs. Um, and that was so when I was at Camp Liberty, that's on the west side of Baghdad. And the new fob that I went to, Fob Shield, is on the east side of Baghdad next to Sadr City. So a bad place.
yes,
Um, and that's where the bad guys like to hang out. It was a very small fob. Um, and it sat inside an Iraqi fob. And the LZ, or the land, where the helicopters landed, was on the Iraqi part. And we had a security company on the camp, so they provided security for all the gates and the towers. And it's a civilian company, so they brought in the Ugandans to do that part. And then they had a lot of South Africans and Americans, because they would also do escorts for like VIPs or whatever. But they would send some of their crew out to secure the LZ anytime a flight was coming in. And that was the means, keep in mind, so 0607 is also the surge. And so IEDs were becoming more prevalent. Also EFPs that were provided by Iran that did a lot more damage. And I'm sorry, I have a brain cramp on now what the EFPs stand for, but it's a copper plate and it could penetrate the vehicles
wow,
and do some serious damage.
indeed.
Um, but anytime, so they would cancel flights a lot because we went through a period where they were getting shot down, and because of the area, Baghdad, Sadr City during the surge, this is a really bad area, and flights were canceled all the time, moving people around. But if I ever needed a medevac, I would get one. God bless those pilots. I have a lot of respect and admiration for them, flying in all those conditions, the point of injuries, and then places, where I was, and in even worse places, and landing to pick up those casualties. Um,
Now, you were close to Sadr City, as you say, which is where the bad guys were, and that was, as I recall, one of the worst areas. Um, how often did your fob, both in Camp Victory and also later the one near Sadr City, how often did you come under attack, either rocket, mortar, or small arms fire?
when I was at Camp Victor or Liberty, ironically, there was a big coordinated attack on December 7th.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it was so, Victory being so big, it was the attacks were all over. And there was a 155 round that came in, and it was quite close to our clinic, and it shook the whole building. Got my attention.
Yeah, would.
um,
Don't need caffeine that time.
Pardon?
You don't need caffeine to keep you awake there.
No, no. And keep in mind, Iraq is it's very dusty.
Right,
And when you hear about the deserts, uh, you think about, like our beaches and stuff. Well, it's not like that. That soil is not that sandy material. It's like a fine powdery material.
right.
And so things would get dusty very easily. So when that rocket mortar came in and shook our clinic, there was all this dust that came down from the rafters, and I turned around and looked down the hall, and it's like smoke bombs went off in the clinic. It was just
Sure.
that bad. And the lights were hanging, the typical ceiling lights.
Mhm.
They're hanging down. And everybody's running out to the bunker, which I don't know, I felt better inside the clinic, because if my time comes, my time comes, I'm going to bite the dust, because the bunkers were these almost like culverts, the big round culverts,
Right.
and they're open on both ends. So if something hits on the outside there, it's just going to go through the tunnel and wipe everybody out. And um, so we all go running out there until we get the all clear. There were a couple other bunkers that people went to, and then we had one casualty that came over. This young, I don't know, I think she was an E4. Her and another person were in a Humvee. They were mail clerks, so they were, can't remember, on the way to the post office or something, and they didn't have the doors on, and there was a piece of shrapnel that just kind of nicked her throat. So nothing serious, fortunately. But she came into our clinic, and I think she was more scared than anything, but she started having some difficulty breathing and swallowing, when, well, we better, the doctor decided that because there was nothing, we did x-rays and there was nothing in there and no significant bleeding. But then, there was concern that with the swelling, is her airway going to be compromised? So we evac her on out of there. In Solder City, so with it being a small clinic, that was a level 1, or like a battalion aid station. It's myself and 4 medics. The buck stops at me.
Mm.
And so there was, we would hear mortars going off or the IEDs going off all the time, and you could look out, climb up in the tower and see, and there's something that happened over here, something that happened over there, because you got the black smoke going up. And but in June, so that would have been June of 07. So the second ID was in our area of operation. They didn't live on our fob, but that was their area to patrol and do missions. So we got a call that they have a casualty, and so they bring him in, and he was shot by a sniper in the head. And we went through everything to try and save him, and we couldn't. And that was a hard day. One of the worst days of my life, but probably a worse day for his family. So when he comes in, I immediately check for a pulse, and there's no pulse. So I have somebody doing CPR, somebody getting on the airway, another one doing the IV, which it's hard to do. It's hard to get an IV when they have a lot of blood loss. And we did everything we could. But in the meantime, while we're working on him, so the security company had sent guys out to secure the LZ. Somebody from the patient's unit had already called for a medevac. And so somebody came into the clinic, while we're working on this guy to let us know the helicopter's there. And I'm like, okay, but can't move him yet. And in the meantime, all of his unit has arrived at my doorstep waiting. They were able to finish up their mission, or everybody like gathered. So there's like a little courtyard outside the clinic. So when we did everything and we couldn't revive him, going out to I walk outside, and the platoon sergeant and platoon leader come up to me, and of course I didn't know who they were at the time, and they introduce themselves, and I give them the bad news. And to have these two guys start crying in front of me was so difficult, and I'm trying to keep it together. And before I went out to tell them, the guy came back in, hey, the pilots want to know, what's going on. I'm like, wave the bird off. So they're outside the clinic and they see the bird take off, but their buddy's still in my clinic.
The buck stops here. That had to be difficult.
It was. It was, because when you're the senior medical person, you're making all the calls at the same time. You can't be freaking out, because then the medics are going to freak out. And you maintain the protocol and what we need to do to revive this guy, but in the long run, really, nobody was going to save this guy, unfortunately. But I wasn't, even though he had no pulse when he came in the door, I couldn't just call it then. We still got to go through the motion to try and save him. And he was in God's hands, and I was just being the worker. It was a very hard day.
I could imagine.
And then, so typically when, somebody's injured, just like in Vietnam, they evac them out and you never see them again. Whether they get evac'd, to the States and they get care back there, you don't see them until you get back home, if you do at all.
Right.
Or if they die, you never see them again. But all these guys are outside my clinic door, and to include the battalion sergeant major and commander.
Wow.
And I told them that, fortunately or unfortunately, because they were able to, be there from the mission, what I want to do is, get things cleaned up, and then you guys can come through and say your goodbyes to him. Because normally they wouldn't be able to do that.
Right.
And so so I had foo-foo bath and body sprays, and and then plus the cleaning agents. And so, we're mopping up the blood on the floor, and wrapping his head with a lot of dressings and putting more dressings inside those bandages, so that when they came in, they wouldn't freak out. And then, I'm spraying some of my foo-foo spray to try and make the clinic smell better, because there is a smell that you never forget when somebody dies like that. And it's the iron in the blood and so on, and the whole philosophy of that. Um, but you don't forget that smell.
No, you don't.
But I wanted to try and make it as easier on the guys if possible, because this is their brother. So they filed through, and like, take your time. And then when it was, so of course the medevac helicopters do not take bodies. So you have to call for a hero flight. Then I had trouble getting a hero flight, oh, it's going to be later tonight before we can get there. And I'm like, I don't have any place to put this guy. It's June in Iraq.
Yeah,
I can't have this guy sitting around, you know. And so his battalion commander helped and made some phone calls, and we got a bird. So when it was time, we packaged him up and took him out to the ambulance. And then my medics drove him over to the LZ, but their guys wanted to put him on the bird. So once they got over there, they unloaded him and put him on the bird for his final flight. I'll never forget his name. And I still think about that at times. On one hand, I know that because of his injury, that I can do all I can to save him, but unless God throws me a miracle, he wasn't going to leave there alive. I on one hand, I know that, but at the same time, it's still hard to know that I couldn't save him.
that's the hard part of the job.
Yeah,
But
reality.
but his unit had to have really appreciated the effort that you put in to allow them to be there, to allow them to see him off. Because like you say, normally they wouldn't have had that opportunity.
Right. And then they don't find out until later, what happens. Yeah. But then so that unit, I can't say we became very close, but so keep in mind, this is a second ID unit, the second infantry division unit, and it's actually a scout unit. And so it's all these infantry guys and I know what their attitude is towards the National Guard. And again, I'm the woman, so I know what their attitude is, and we've had to prove ourselves, that being National Guard, we are worthy. So we had a really, and even before him, with some other patients, we developed a great rapport. And I mean, I definitely respected them because, they're going out doing the hard work. And before I left, the sergeant major gave me his second ID patch.
Wow.
Which is pretty impressive.
That's an honor.
Yeah.
And
then they gave me a certificate and a coin, for taking care of their guys. And that made it hard to leave on one hand when it was time for the end of our deployment. So the new unit comes in and you do what's called a left seat, right seat, to teach them what you've been doing and how things operate and so on and so forth. And there was a nurse practitioner that replaced me who had been in a clinic, like a head nurse in a clinic for the majority of her career. And so knowing what these guys are going through and deal with, so we're doing our drug inventory so I can hand, her, so she gets to sign for the drugs and then it's her control. And so some of the drugs that are locked up, the controlled drugs, are what's called RSI drugs. So it's rapid sequence intubation. So it's what they use like in surgery to kind of knock you out to
Right.
intubate you. And she asked me what that was for, what those drugs were for. And my heart just fell because, these are life-saving drugs. And some of the other, the atropine or whatever. And then when we're going through the equipment and we get to the intubation equipment, she's like, "Did you have to use that?" I'm like, "Yes." And her eyes get all big, and I'm like, because I was just sad. I'm like, thinking to myself, did you do any prep work to come here? You're a nurse practitioner. You might be saving somebody's life. So given that, it was hard for me because it's still during the surge to just walk away from all that. I mean, but I didn't have a choice. But it was like a gut punch in a way.
Sure.
Um,
And that was her oh crap moment
mhm.
when you said, yes, I had to use the intubation. And she's probably been trained on it, but never did, and hoped she never would, and realized that she certainly might have to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you don't know what the RSI drugs are, you better open some books and figure it out, because if you have to, I mean, if they're already unconscious and they don't have, their heart's not beating, I mean, obviously you don't need those drugs to intubate somebody. But if you have somebody that has, burns or swelling and you need to intubate them, you have to knock them down because they're going to fight it.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Nobody wants a tube being shoved down their throat.
Right. And then if you have to run a code, you need to know what those drugs are too, to save somebody's life. And so it was just hard, having built this rapport with those guys and what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I had to remind myself, well, I have to let it go because I have no control over it, and whatever's going to happen is going to happen.
So you went back to the States at that point?
Yes. We came back and we went to Camp Atterbury, Indiana for our demob, and they had just cut the grass. And it was the best thing that I haven't smelled in a long time. To smell that fresh cut grass was just amazing. It's the little things that make a big difference.
Indeed.
Yeah. And then I come back, and so the month before we came back, so you have the FRG, which is the Family Readiness Group. So your family members back home, they go once a month to a meeting, and the unit would do a phone call with them, and then have a soldier, also get to talk to them. And so the month before we go back, they're prepping the families for us to come back. And I found out from my family after that, during one of my phone calls with them, that, they told him that the soldier, your loved one that left, when he or she comes back, is going to be a different person. And I was so angry. I'm like, how dare they tell our families that, you know, what do you mean we're different people, you know, like we're all a bunch of whack jobs or something. It took me a long time to realize that, you know, there was something to that. Um, you don't go to war and come back the same, as you know.
Yeah.
Um, and on one hand, sometimes I would just do things to mess with my family.
Knowing you, I could see that.
Just because, you know, they're like looking at you, and you know, I could see that look. And but then I finally, it took months for me to finally realize that, okay, yes, I am different from the person I left as. Um, I found that my patience was a little bit shorter, because I've always been a very patient person, but the nitnoid stuff doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You know, it just doesn't matter. It's not important. And we are all replaceable. You know, when your number comes up, your number comes up. I wasn't afraid of um, I wasn't afraid of dying over there. I was more afraid of being maimed. But my biggest concern was something happening to me and my mom having to be notified, because I didn't want that to happen. Because I know it, you know, it just, fortunately it didn't. Um, but I just learned that, you know, through those experiences, that all this stuff is not important anymore. Um, you know, the drama, the you know, it's um you're here, you got a plate, you got a roof over your head, you got clothes on your back, you got a place to sleep, nobody's shooting at you, nobody's trying to blow you up. um Life is good, God is good.
Indeed. Indeed.
Yeah.
I, so now that you've returned home, most vets that experience combat, through my experience some level of PTSD. So what was your experiences, and did you have any kind of instances of PTSD? And what are your feelings about that, given the veterans that you know now, and those that came back with you?
Yes. um it took me a while to realize that um that I had some PTSD issues. So when I came back, I bought a new house, and I can hear the freeway from here sometimes. And if a semi hit a pothole on the freeway and I was sitting outside, it sounds almost like an explosion. And I become quite jumpy. I'm startled very easily. So it took me a while to get used to those sounds when I would hear something like that.
Mhm.
And um, you know, they say some of it gets better. Well, I actually today at the gym, um, something happened with the sound system, and it made this awful noise, but it startled me. And one of my friends, like, you know, are you don't have to be jumpy. So they mess with me with that, but that's okay. I went through periods of having trouble sleeping, um, and some, I don't want to call them flashbacks because they're not, they're just reminders, if you will.
Yeah.
Um, and sometimes there's a smell or a sound or something that happens that takes you, reminds you of something that happened over there. And so the first time that I went to the VA to try and claim that, they had me go through all these things, and they said that I didn't have PTSD because, why would they tell me that? Because I don't have nightmares per se. I didn't call them nightmares. I just have these very vivid, bizarre dreams. So it's like Quentin Tarantino and I don't know, somebody, Stephen King kind of got together and wrote movies, and those are my dreams. You know, almost like the Alice in Wonderland. Yeah, just things that are so disconnected but very vivid. Those are my dreams. And I have dreams that I'm back in the military a lot. And I'm always trying to find something. So I have gone to counseling because of that. And so when we were talking about my dreams, he asked if I was looking for something. And I'm like, yeah, how do you know that? And he's like, there's a trend with the veterans who have PTSD that in their dreams, they're looking for something that they can't find. And it's, yeah. And sometimes it's exhausting because these dreams are so active and so bizarre and so off the wall and vivid that I wake up and I'm just like, oh, and then something will happen throughout the day. And it makes me wonder, did I dream that or was it real?
Yeah.
Kind of situation. But so I was denied initially, for PTSD because I don't have nightmares. Because there's criteria and I get that. But so then I refiled later because there's some other issues that I have PTSD from too as well, from the military. Something that happened in Iraq. So yeah, but I think and something that made me feel better was that one of my classmates from PA school, and he was in combat units, infantry units as a PA, so he was there, knocking the doors, whatever with the guys. And so something he just posted, one that he has it, and that he's going through the what's called post-traumatic growth. So instead of dwelling on the PTS or PTSD, whatever you want to call it, it's learning how to grow beyond that and have a better life. And, so he was talking about that, and he said, right now I'm at peace. And so that it was good to, one, hear him say that, because one, it's a guy, two, with the infantry units. And I've often wondered how him or some of the other guys that some of my classmates in those kind of units are doing. But yeah, but it's at the same time, it's hard because I'm a PA.
Right.
And, I don't have a shield that protects me. But I don't know, it's like in my mentality is that, well, that's supposed to happen to other people, not me. But at the same time, it was hard to accept. Yeah.
So Terry, you retire from the military after 36 and a half years, both active and reserve with the Ohio National Guard as a full major. When you retired, I know you've been active with several different veterans projects and things. Can you tell me a little bit about your veterans activity and why that's so important to you?
Oh, yeah. So I started volunteering with Honor Flight Columbus, which is a program that came about from World War II veterans, and was actually started here in Ohio. So Honor Flight Columbus and all the other Honor Flight hubs, we take senior veterans, so Vietnam veteran and veteran or Vietnam era and older veterans to Washington, D.C. to see their memorials, to honor them and their service, so that they can share their stories with us and to celebrate their service, as well as give them a wonderful homecoming, especially for those that in the Vietnam era did not receive one. So it's a one-day trip. We fly out early in the morning from Port Columbus, and then we fly to Washington, D.C., and take them around to the various memorials, starting, well, it varies on the schedule, but, and then also the changing of the guard. So we see the World War II Memorial, the Korean Memorial, the Vietnam Memorial, also the Marine Memorial, which is Iwo Jima, the Navy Memorial and the Air Force, I'm sorry, yeah, the memorials. And then we also drive around to some other places. The past year, well, the past 2 years or year and a half, we've been eating at the Women's Memorial, which is at the entrance of Arlington National Cemetery. So I started doing that a year after I retired. In my first flight was September of 2016, which happened to be an all-women veteran flight. And it was truly awesome. And I was hooked. So to go with those veterans. And then I signed up, let's see, 2017, I did all but I think two, and the same with 2018. And then we didn't get started in 2019 because of COVID. Our flights usually start in the spring in April, not usually, they start in April. And then we do, I think we're up to 5 in the spring, and then like average 5 in the fall. We take the summer off because it's too hot, and then obviously we take the winter off because it's too cold. But to share the day with those veterans and to watch them go through their experiences, whether they've been to Washington, D.C. or not, and be with them when they visit their memorials, hear their stories and their experiences in the military. I tell them, I don't know who enjoys the day more, them being, the special person for the day, or me being with them and watching them enjoy that day, because it's just a wonderful experience, and it's my way to give back to the veterans who came before me. We pay our way. The Guardians do. The trip is free for all of the veterans. Now it costs about $100,000 per trip, and that includes the plane, the buses, the food, everything else you can think of for the day. And I'm very blessed that I'm able to do that and participate in that as well. So it's my passion.
Well, that's really special because you've spent so much of your own time in the military, and then just keep giving back afterwards is I know it's really appreciated because everybody that I know that's been on an honor flight has just talked about how special it was and how special the Guardians are. Um, we have them here in Pittsburgh, although not as many as you do in Columbus, but that is amazing. You also are a docent at the Military Museum, are you not?
Yes, at the National Veterans Memorial Museum, which opened October of 2018. So I'm one of the original volunteers or docents since it opened up. I do that once a week, and that. So somebody asked me once, "What is my favorite part or exhibit in the museum?" And so there is an honor flight shirt in there from Nevada. But my favorite part are the veterans coming in the door. Again, to talk to those veterans and ask them, what branch did you serve? When did you serve? What was your job? And just, some of those basic questions. And then sometimes that opens the door just to hear some of the stories, and sometimes stories that they've never shared with a family member. And to have that spouse, the brother, the son, or a relative standing there listening to these stories that they've never heard. Because as you know, and I don't tell them that I'm a veteran, but when you talk the lingo, they kind of pick up that, well, okay, she kind of knows something. Um, but there's that special bond between veterans, and it doesn't matter which branch you served in, or what era you served in, what your job was. There is that connection between the veterans. But to come in and, give them an overview or give a tour, or, just listen to them, or, but at the same time, not take their time from seeing all the stories and exhibits that we have, and also to find that balance, to let them know that we appreciate them and we thank them for their service, but yet, so that they have time to walk around and view everything, as well as answer their questions. So again, it's just a way to give back, since I'm retired. I can't just sit around at home and do nothing. And initially, I kept my certification going as a PA, and also my state license renewed in case I decided to go back to work like on a part-time basis. But then after, ironically, it was so my license is renewed December every 2 years, and I let it expire. And then, so I think that was actually January. And then COVID came in March, I think it was. So, I was talking to people in the military and at the hospital where I worked, do I need to go back and renew everything? Because they were asking people to come back and work, because of the COVID crisis. But fortunately, I wasn't needed. So I have stayed retired. But I need to do something with the veterans. And then it's also a way to stay connected. Even though it's not the veterans that I served with, I still talk to some of them, but I have an appreciation for those that came before me. And plus it's to hear their stories is something special too.
Well, I know how special that is because the Veterans Breakfast Club took a trip to the museum where we first met you. And your interaction with a good friend of mine who had been severely injured in Vietnam and was looking at that particular section of the exhibit, and you came over and he talked with you, and that interaction with someone who was in those life-saving skills of a PA, and the respect that he has for the doctors and nurses that treated him, because he had been considered a bleeder and somebody that they weren't going to work on because they didn't think they'd be able to save him. And for some reason, they decided they would. And here he is all these years later. And I know just the interaction between the two of you was worth the trip to Ohio by itself. So what you do is awfully special, and it is truly appreciated by the veterans that you interact with. And I know all of the vets from Honor Flight would say the same thing to you. So is there anything else you want to say in kind of summation of your story?
When I first joined the military, it was a 6-year obligation. I had no idea that when I said I will, I do, and all that good stuff, that I would be serving 36 years. I couldn't even see beyond the 6 years. And God has blessed me in so many ways and put things in front of me, the opportunities and experiences that helped me grow in so many ways. And so I'm grateful for my time in the military. And I don't think I would have changed anything. And for those veterans that haven't signed up for Honor Flight, they really need to do so. The veterans, just as you hear, the veterans say that is one of the best, if not the best day of their life. If they're with their wife, they may say the second best after getting married, but but to be part of that experience and part of that organization, it's a wonderful organization to give back to those veterans. I can't say enough about it.
Well, fantastic. I am so glad that you decided to do this interview and to get your story down on record so that it can be shared, and try to make sure that the vets in Ohio get to see it as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad that I was volunteering the day that you guys came in from the Veterans Breakfast Club, because that also not only allowed me to meet you and the other veterans, but it also opened the door to going on the European trip in the what was that? The European, the battlefield tour in the
battlefields.
Yeah, in the footsteps of Dick Winters.
Mm-hmm.
As well as going to New Orleans to visit the World War II museum with you guys. So, yet another door opened and another friendship developed, and I'm grateful for that as well.
Indeed, and you were a participant in VBC Jeopardy and did quite well.
Well, I wouldn't say quite well, but yes.
No, you did.
Yeah,
well,
and I love what you guys do at the Veterans Breakfast Club.
Well, thanks for telling your story, and we've got a friendship that will last forever.
Yes, we do.
Thank you, Terri.
Thank you very much, Larry.